Everyone, and welcome to Attitude Magazine's weekly ADHD Experts broadcast. Today, this webinar continues our Success at School series, and our topic today, is an interesting one. It's accommodations for college students with ADHD and LD. I'm so pleased to welcome Elizabeth Hamlet. She's the author of From High School to College, Steps for Success for Students with Disabilities. And as most of you know, disability services for students with ADHD and LD are quite different in college than those in high school and earlier. They just don't happen unless the student initiates the process herself or himself. And the services themselves may be quite different from school to school and from what you're used to. So knowing which accommodations are more probably available to college students can be really helpful. And today, Elizabeth Hamlet will be talking about how disability services do typically work in college, which accommodations are commonly and frequently granted or not frequently granted, what categories of accommodations colleges don't need to grant because of exemptions in the law, and how changes in the academic environment in college and strategies can help students navigate the world around them in a different way. So, thank you so much for joining us today, Elizabeth Hamlet. We're so pleased to have you.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here.
Let me introduce Elizabeth to you. She is a learning consultant at Columbia University's Disability Services Office. She's worked at the college level for 20 years and gives presentations nationally to both education professionals and parents about how to prepare students with disabilities for success at school. As I mentioned, she's the author of From High School to College, Steps for Success with Students with Disabilities, and she's written widely in national journals and online. You might want to take down a note of her website. It's www.ldadvisory.com, and there's a contact link for her there. So if after we finish this presentation you have further questions, you can reach out to her via her website. Let me mention a few housekeeping tips for those of you who may be new to Attitude webinars. We're following the same format as usual. Please post your questions in the box on your screen in your control panel anytime they occur to you. Your participation is anonymous. After Elizabeth Hamlet has finished her presentation, she'll answer as many questions as she has time for. And if you have any problems hearing us, you have to dial in with your phone line. It's probably an internet connection problem, which not infrequently occurs. If you'd like to take notes, go ahead and download her slides now in the control panel on your right in the handout section. You'll also see another handout there. And after the session ends, you'll find a replay of this webinar, including the presentation slides on the Attitude website, attitudemag.com/webinars. So with that, let me thank Elizabeth again and let her start her presentation. Thanks so much for being here.
Thank you, Susan, and thanks to everybody for joining us today. I'm really pleased to be able to reach this audience. It's one that I care a lot about. So I just like to put my little caveats out first. So I do work for Columbia University, but anything I say today, they are not responsible for. These views are my own. They don't represent Columbia's, and nothing here obviously is legal or medical advice. I also want to say that I'm going to use the word we today, and that refers to college disability service providers in general. What's really important to know, I recently saw a figure that there are at least 4,200 community and four-year colleges in this country. Well, that certainly is a lot. And so I'm trying to give you a general sense of the environment based on my 20 years in the field, my participation in communities with other professionals, my readings of research, to give you an overall sense of what students can expect. But I do want to say that there are lots of schools out there. And if I say today that, it's unlikely that students will find something available to them, it may be that if your student does enough research, she can find a school that does exactly what she wants. So, I'm here to help educate and empower you by letting you know sort of what the scene looks like at the college level. It's my hope I will not scare anybody, so to speak, but that you will have it come away with an understanding and feel like you know what you need to do. And that's what I mean when I say I don't know everything. There may be a school, and often when I'm out, I travel the country doing these presentations, and I will say something and somebody will put a hand up and say, well, my student got that at such and such university, to which I say, that's wonderful. It's just not the expectation that maybe you should have at every school. So I have this visual because I do find that the people that I speak with tend to fall into three, as the expressions goes, buckets. So, you know, I think on one end of the spectrum, we have people who don't think that students with disabilities can go to college because they just assume that colleges would not have to make any learning accommodations for these kinds of students, just because they haven't had the information that we actually do this. And so, you know, I'm very concerned about people who would discourage students from even applying to or thinking about college because they just assume that there are no services and accommodations. I do run into people who either maybe because they were college graduates, you know, college students with disabilities who accessed accommodations, or they've already had a student go through, or they've had the good fortune to work with high school staff who is knowledgeable, you know what to expect. And then, you know, what I worry about is on the other end of this spectrum are the people who assume that because their student received certain accommodations in high school, that colleges automatically have to do the same things for them, and that, you know, there's an entitlement that goes along with having had high school services. And it's important to me to reach them to make sure that they have a realistic understanding of what really goes on. So we'll return to that visual. Oops, sorry, I forgot to click the other way. Oh, going the wrong way, apologize. Here we go. So I think what's important is to sort of set this up with the foundation of understanding the shifts that are going on as your students move from high school to college. So if your student has an IEP, that's provided for under the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. We call it IDEA of 2004. And also Subpart D of Section 504. So if your student has a 504 plan, which, you know, I see a lot of for students with ADHD, they don't always get put on IEPs in my experience, you know, is also in place there. And the ADA is in place at the high school, but we don't talk about it that much because these other laws are actually much more prescriptive. Now, at the college level, we are under Section 504, but we are under Subpart E. And if you really want to kill some time, you are invited to go online, find the law itself, and you can see how vastly different Subpart D is from Subpart E. Subpart E is much briefer, and it places a lot less in the way of demands on colleges. And so it's really important to understand we are talking about the same law overall, but the demands are very different between these two subparts. And the ADA is in place too. Now, for those of you with kids on an IEP, obviously IDEA is an education law. And the reason that I mention this is I think that this is key to this discussion. An education law is covering so very many things for so very many different kinds of students. And it's extremely formalized because if you think about K through 12, it is mandatory. And students are going to be there, you know, and we are trying to do the best we can with students during their formative years to help them, you know, pursue their dreams, if you will. So under that, we have this very formal system. We have to find students that might have a disability. We have to test them if it seems that they might give them specialized instruction, aids if deemed appropriate. We adapt the content. And this is really important. This is in the wording of the law. Make sure that students can meet district's educational standards. We also report on their progress. And those of you who have a student on an IEP are used to a very formal system where you get this, you know, multi-page plan every year and you have all these meetings, right? And you get your progress reports. Well, none of that happens at the college level. So they are civil rights laws that address discrimination in place at college. And so what's different about that is these are not laws written to talk about education. They cover education as a public service, and that's actually true even at private colleges, so don't be worried about that. But their focus is very different, and if you look up either of these laws online, what you'll see is discussions of things like even public utilities and transportation and hotels. These are not laws focused on education. And I'm not saying, again, remember, I'm not a lawyer, that is the reason we don't have certain things, but I think it helps to explain things. So we don't write plans for students. I have this expression LOA or EOA, which stands for letter of accommodation or email of accommodation, which is how your students will communicate to their professors what their accommodations are. It's provided by the DS office. We don't meet with their professors every semester to see how they're doing. We don't even have a special education department. If you hear about a college with a great special ed department, that is the department that is training students to be special ed teachers. We are called disability services. And I think it's an important distinction because we are not educating the kids. We are just providing these accommodations. And in some cases, it's not even an actual full office. There's might just be an ADA officer who could be a dean of undergraduate studies or student affairs or something like that. We don't track your students. We have no idea how they're doing, and we certainly can't report on their progress if we don't track them. So the kinds of things that parents are used to, which I have to think your students probably don't think anything of unless they're very, empowered kids, is not going to really make a difference to them. And what's really important too is that, and this is not going to apply to all high school students, but we do not make modifications at the college level. We provide accommodations, and I'm going to get to that in a moment. And also, we don't provide special instruction or classes. So what's great for your students, if they've been in classes that were just for kids with special ed and felt stigmatized about that, they will not find that at the college level. Let me see if I can press the right button this time. Come on. Nope. Here we go. Whoops. Too fast, sorry. So these definitions come from 3 of the experts in the field, and I've given you the reference there. But what's really important about this is this difference. So at the college level, we provide accommodations, which are supports or services that allow students to access our curriculum, but it doesn't change the content taught or any of the expectations for students' performance. Modifications, on the other hand, do exactly that. And you will find that we really don't make modifications at college. So I've given you the example here of reduction in the amount of work students have to do, or swapping out different kinds of exams. We generally don't do that. Remember what I said, we generally don't do that. Does that mean no student in the world is getting that at some particular college? No, but it will be very unusual for that to happen. And part of the reason for that is there are these exemptions that we find in the law. And so the 2 that I think are most relevant to our audience today are these 2 that I've laid out. So in the laws, it does say that colleges don't have to make an accommodation that would be a fundamental alteration to their programs. So that actually begins at the admissions level. If you don't have 4 years of foreign language at a school that says it's required to apply for admission, they don't have to accept you because you are a student with a learning disability or ADHD. Can they? Absolutely, and I'm sure some of them do, but they don't have to. So that's that entitlement piece that is important to talk about. You're not entitled to an exemption in the admission standards. And then once you get into a college, every college generally has these graduation requirements. Where I went to college at the time, it was 6 semesters of foreign language that you had to pass. Well, if you can't pass those 6 semesters, you don't get to graduate. Now, do colleges make substitutions for some of those courses? Yes, they do. Do they have to? No, they don't. Will they? That's something you have to talk to the DS office about while you're doing your searches. So it's really important to ask, is this something that you get asked for a lot? Do you guys do that a lot? And schools, may not have numbers available to you, but they can possibly give you a general sense of it. And they're not going to be able to sit down and say, yes, your student sitting right in front of me here is going to be the one who gets the substitution. But you could talk to them about what kinds of things they would expect to see in order to make a substitution. I'm very wary of using that W word, waiver, because generally credit hours don't go away if you don't have to take the the required math classes. You might be required to take logic classes instead. I'd be very careful, especially when it comes to the math stuff. Sometimes students say that the logic courses are probably more difficult than the math classes they think they were allowed to substitute. So, there are some resources students can use to look at this. The other category of exemption is we don't have to provide a personal service. And what that means at the college level is at a lot of schools, there is no special tutoring or support available to students with ADHD or learning disabilities. The people who run disability services office, there was a study done a number of years ago by a professional organization I belong to, and I don't think more than half of the people running offices had a background in disabilities or rehabilitation sciences, I think is what it's called, as you might expect. So the people running those offices probably don't do academic support or learning support anyway. But even in the tutoring centers, there doesn't have to be anybody with special qualifications. If the tutoring center has sessions where it's 1 tutor to 5 students, students with disabilities who are registered with our office are not entitled to a smaller ratio of tutor to student. They're not entitled to more tutoring sessions per week. Now, that said, sometimes schools will make those accommodations for them if they ask, or if not, if the writing center is drop-in basis only, sometimes students with disability are allowed to schedule those appointments ahead of time. But it's really important to go in knowing really sort of how low the floor is, and then look for schools that provide more. I've also mentioned devices here. Some of you may be familiar with these text-to-speech programs like Read and Write Gold or Kurzweil or Win. When students are found eligible for alternative text, alternative format, that we would provide their book in PDF format so it could be read by that software. We don't actually have to provide the software, we just have to make sure that they can get their books in the format to be read by it. But the software would be viewed as a personal device. Having said that, many colleges buy this software with, I forget what the name for the license is, and anybody who qualifies for it with disability services can access it. I do know a student who goes to a school where it's on the school system and anybody can use it with a student ID. So that's something that you can look for. So now that I've told you what doesn't have to happen, let's talk about what students, what they do get. Oh, but before I move on, I did want to mention that I get this question all the time. What about the IEPs or the 504s? So I think a lot of people know that because IDEA doesn't cover colleges, it only covers K through 12 or students who stay in the system until they age out. Their plans, I always use this word and so do others, they expire. They're no longer legally valid. Now, there's a lot of confusion over 504 plans that I hear out there, but again, we are under Subpart E, Subpart D, and I'm not saying that's a legal explanation as to why those plans don't carry over, but they essentially expire too. So I'm here to tell you that you don't just show up at college with your 504 plan and we have to follow it. Will we? It all depends on what's in there, and that's what we're going to talk about. So again, what this means, and not to scare you, is just because colleges don't have to provide the services or accommodations that your students receive doesn't mean that they won't. It just depends on what your student is using. So now let's see if I can finally get to the right slide. So these are the things that I think you'll find commonly available to students who are found eligible at most colleges. Extended time for exams is a very common accommodation. Sometimes students, instead of extended time, with the clock running, they get more time, instead can have breaks where the clock is stopped for them and they can have, 5 or 10 minutes and then, sort of pull themselves back together, refocus, and then they start the clock again. So those are very common accommodations. I would say the most popular time is what my office calls 1.5 times, which is 1.5 times the amount that the class gets. So for a 2-hour exam, you would have 3 hours to take it. I just read a very interesting study at a college with a pretty decent number of students involved that found that even though most students were approved for at least 1.5 and sometimes for 2, I think 85% of them used 1.25 times or less. So I want students to know that, only because it probably means that even if they don't get all of the time that they ask for, they're probably going to be fine. Remember that college exams are much longer than a high school exam, and so they may not need as much time as they think they do in the context of a shorter high school exam time. Reduce distraction site, and it's very important to say not distraction free, because there is no such thing for most students with ADHD. But instead of being in that big freshman lecture hall with 100 students, you might be in a classroom, let's say with 10 other students and a proctor. So that's something to ask for. Permission to use a laptop with a spell checker for their students who really have difficulty spelling correctly. If you have a documented problem with written organization, you might get this accommodation. If your handwriting is illegible even to you, you can certainly ask for this. And also a calculator. Now, in most college classes, students are actually expected to have these crazy calculators that do all sorts of things. But if for some reason there's a class where your basic calculation is being tested, that's when I have that asterisk there, both of these. Remember what I said about fundamental alteration. If a class exam is testing your calculation skills, giving you a calculator would be a fundamental alteration of what we're trying to measure, and you probably couldn't have it. The same is true if spelling is involved. If for some reason you need to be able to spell certain terms correctly as part of what's being measured by a test, you probably can't have a spell checker. But I would say in most college classes, that's not going to be a problem. In the classroom, I have these 3 note-taking accommodations. You have note takers, permission to record, and permission to use your laptop for note taking. Now, note takers are the kinds of things that a lot of students say, oh, I need that. I need a copy of somebody else's notes. Well, remember that note takers are just somebody else in the class. And so it's not a professional note taker. And, there are schools, my school does vet students who want to be note takers. We actually check their notes to see if they're quality, but a lot of schools don't have the time or the ability to do that. So it's not always the golden ticket. Also, if you don't come to class at a lot of colleges, you don't get the notes, because it's not an accommodation for being out of class. Your classmates who miss class because they're sick, have to find the notes. And the same would be true for students with learning disabilities and ADHD. But if you, I'm sorry, I lost my train of thought there. But anyway, sorry. So the note taker is something that may be easy to get at a lot of schools. It may not be, it depends. But permission to record, we have these wonderful devices, these smart pens that schools are buying in bulk and loaning out to students, in exchange for a deposit in case they break or lose them. And these pens, while students are taking notes, are recording the class. And then it makes catching up on the stuff that you missed much easier, because when they touch the pen to the paper, it jumps to the part of the recording that they missed. And they can hear it again and again and fill in their notes. And a lot of places, it's not a big deal to have your laptop in class. There are professors who don't like it because they think they're a distraction. A student approved for this accommodation would therefore have permission to use a laptop. Now, notice what's missing from this list of commonly approved accommodation, which is extended time for out-of-class assignments, all of your papers and projects. And this is the thing that often, elicits gasps when I do these in person. Students who have trouble organizing their time and sticking to deadlines are going to find that they are not getting this as a blanket accommodation at a lot of colleges. Students generally have at least a week to do their papers, and they are expected to figure out how to get them done in that amount of time. So there are resources at most schools, like I said, a tutoring center, a writing center, and they can go to these people and ask for help breaking their projects down, creating interim deadlines. then they have to stick to them, and there's really no magic service that's going to allow them, to help them do this, but at least I can get help in taking an approach to it. In my experience, over 3 colleges, over 20 years, I have had students at every place who have appealed to professors on their own, gotten an extension, and they almost always blow the second deadline. My suspicion is that students who are used to extended deadlines don't use up all the time that they've been given to write their papers. They just put off when they're going to start the paper by the number of days they've now had an extension. And if that seems unfair or unkind, I apologize. That's what I have seen. But I have not seen it go particularly well. So it's really important while students are still in high school, if they're getting that accommodation, to not just pull that accommodation away, but to make sure somebody is helping them learn how to manage their time and how to break down assignments so that when they get to college, they are all ready to go. I want to show you this slide from a research study. The National Longitudinal National Longitudinal Transition Study looked at the experiences of 12,000 students across the country over 10 years. And I think what's really important is the numbers here don't represent all those 12,000. I've taken this data from those who attended four-year colleges, and obviously of those who actually asked for accommodations, 72% of them who used extended time for assignments in high school, only 6% of those students received it at their four-year college. A calculator, again, when others couldn't use one, 33% versus 6%. Modified alternative tests, 37% of those students were getting that in high school, only 1% got that in college. Shorter or different assignments from 30% down to 3%. And I would say the modified grading standards that, less than 0.001%, statistics are not my deal, but I would think that that's probably so, insignificant at that number. So I just want to let you know, when we talked about, what's the likelihood of these things happening, this is from a national study. So my advice for your students is, before they graduate from high school, that they prepare a list of accommodations that they want to request with their case manager, whoever they're working with. And it should be a list that is explicit. The kids should know what accommodations they're receiving. And I have, in 20 years, met some students who didn't realize that what was happening was actually an accommodation that they had to ask for. And the research also backs that up. So they need to know what their accommodations are. And when I say explanations, they're probably going to fill out a registration form at any university that says, what accommodations are you requesting and why do you need them, or how are they relevant to your functioning? Somebody needs to be able to explain to them, so they can explain to others, how their disability affects their functioning and why this accommodation makes sense given that weakness. And there's a great there are some great webinars out there talking about self-advocacy and teaching students, what their strengths are. And I think that that is important. And a conversation should always start with student strengths. But if they don't have weaknesses, they don't have a disability that needs accommodation. So we have to be able to have a grown-up conversation about why it would be appropriate for them to have these accommodations. I suggest that they ask for everything they want. As I said to you here, I don't know everything, and the college that they're going to might very well grant them what they want. So I think that, you should encourage them to, if you see a lot of things on that list, the ones that I just showed you that are unlikely to be granted, I think you should alert them to the idea. And hopefully by the time they're graduating and making this list, they have the skills that they need, and they know that, to be able to cope without those accommodations. And insurance policy is the expression I use. As I alluded to, in the research, we have seen that students don't always ask for accommodations, and there are a variety of reasons why. Ask them to register as an insurance policy. And what I mean is, once they get approved for it, they don't have to use it. We literally can't make students use their accommodations, but if they don't ask, they won't get. So tell them to just register with us as soon as they enroll at college. And if they never come and use their accommodations, that's going to be fine. But if they decide the night before the first midterm exam that maybe they should have registered, it's going to be too late to help them for that exam. And it doesn't mean they can't register later, but they're not going to get accommodated for tomorrow morning's biology exam. So they should just do this. It doesn't cost anything. They should just register with us and then know that they have that in their back pocket if they need it. Whoops, sorry, I'm a little too eager with these. So how do students get access to accommodation? This is so much easier. If you've ever filled out the FAFSA, I am telling you this looks like a walk in the park. So typically, and you should be able to find this information online at your college's website, find the disability services page, and it should tell them exactly what they need to do. So typically there's a form you have to fill out, name, address, email, all of that stuff. And often they will ask, as I said, what accommodations are you asking for? Most colleges ask kids to tell them what they are asking for. They don't just leave it that they're going to assess it once they do it. They do want to know from students what accommodations they think they need. At some schools, there will also be an intake meeting, but it depends on the school and how many people they have available to meet with students. And then they have to provide documentation, and I do not have time in today's webinar to do that, but if you go to the families and students page on my website, there's a lot of information I've tried to offer there about documentation and some other topics. Generally, once they're approved, they get an LOA, and the students at a lot of colleges are responsible for giving those to their professors. However, that varies from school to school. But that's how simple the registration process is. So what I think I really wanted to do here too is, now that I've told you what kinds of things students can and can't expect in the way of accommodations, I just wanted to talk a little bit about the environment and things that we can try to help prepare students for, especially perhaps in the absence of some accommodations and services that they might be accustomed to. So, 90% of what I do with my students at Columbia is time management. And it's a problem really for all freshmen. And I read another study where, half the students in the general population wished that they had learned more about time management before they came to college. So part of it is they have no idea how much time to spend on assignments, because there's often no deliverable. You're not reading a chapter and turning in chapter questions at the next class. You're just reading those things on their own. So my mentor, Lauren Brinkerhoff, had recommended in an article years ago that they start with the idea of spending 6 hours a week. And that is 6 hours spent doing the readings, problem sets if they're in that kind of class, reviewing notes. And again, that's not a number carved in stone. It's just a number to start with. And then if certain classes require more, you add more. If certain classes require less, you don't need to spend that much time. But I think it's important to give kids at least a number to start with so that they have some idea, and then they can use that as a way of deciding more or less. They also don't know when to study. So on my website, you'll see the link in the handout. I have the tool that I use with my students. It's a very low-tech grid of hours of the week where students create a schedule for themselves, and it's like a template where they try to follow that every week. If they make the decision at the beginning of the semester, every Tuesday from 2 to 4, I'm going to the library to work on my bio homework, then that's a way of creating structure where it doesn't exist. Of course, distractions when you are living amongst your peers can be a huge problem for students. So it's hard to drag yourself away from stuff. So how do you make yourself accountable? Well, you can meet your friend at the library for that Tuesday 2 to 4 time block. And then you guys sit at the opposite, carols, three carols away from each other, or at a big study table, but not right next to each other, so that you're keeping each other on task, but you're not actually interacting and socializing. So these are some ideas that your students can use. Classes are going really fast. There's a lot of information, and some professors really don't even get around to discussing the readings because they expect students to do that stuff on their own. So students who are finding that professors are moving too fast should go to office hours, ask the professor to look at their notes, see if they've missed anything major, see if there are study groups where other members of the class are getting together to compare notes, quiz each other, things like that. They should go to every class. That is not just because I'm a mom and a teacher, but you never know what you're going to miss. Professors, again, don't always give you anything to do after the reading. So there's a strategy called SQ3R, and there's a link here. You can look up one of the write-ups I found online that I think is pretty good for how to approach your reading and try to, create your own questions so you have something to look at later as in the way of notes. They can meet with their classmates, again, or bring their questions to office hours if they're not sure whether they're getting what they should out of their reading. And sometimes they're in these freshman classes where they have to read some very abstract stuff. So one of the things SQ3R encourages people to do is start to think about what they know ahead of time. You're trying to create like what we call a schema for taking in this reading. Well, if you look on the internet to see what is Plato's Republic about, and you get one paragraph summary, at least lets you know what you're going to be reading about, and that can be very helpful for comprehension. Whoops. And back to those papers. Very often professors only want to see the final draft. They don't want to see your, they're not going to work you through it. So again, tutoring centers, writing centers, ask them to help you create those interim deadlines. Try to set up your writing appointments as soon as you know when the assignment is so you can get ahead of your other classmates. So there are some resources available. And also sometimes classes are really long and they're just some professor lecturing with no visuals, and it's just a lot of listening. So for our students who are hyperactive or whose inattention, frankly, just, they can only hang in. Some of those, I remember taking lecture classes that were 3 hours long. Some of you may be familiar with the Watchminder, which will vibrate on your student's wrist. Sitting in front, rarely is there a fight for those seats in the front of a college class. I'm sure you will find plenty of room in your choice of locations. Fidgets, there's some great resources out there on what is and is not an appropriate fidget, what's too distracting to be useful. I have one of those fidget cubes, but my boss doesn't like it because she thinks it's noisy, so I have something else that doesn't make noise. Chewing gum or, drinking caffeinated beverages, being very careful though. There's, I see students walking around with these enormous coffees and wonder when they ever get to bed. And, the Red Bull and the energy drinks obviously have their own risks, but that can be a way for that late afternoon class that's just a lot of sitting around. So, I'm sorry to be rushing through. There's so many things I want to say, but I wanted to bring you back to this visual because wherever you were on this spectrum before, I like to think everybody is now in the middle and knows what to expect and perhaps what not to expect. Some strategies students can use to handle the shifts at the college level. Now, here is the title of my book, which is coming out in a few weeks. I do want to say when I prepared this, the second edition of this book, which goes under this title, is not ready yet. That said, you can pre-order it if you like. However, if you just can't wait a few weeks and want a copy of a book right now, on my website, there's a link called Book Sale, and I have some copies of the first edition that you can get. It's also available on Amazon right now if you want that, or through my publisher if you want to know a lot more about all these topics. I've got a list of resources for you in the handouts. But also, if you go to my site, there's a lot of free information under families and students. So copies of the work that I have done for various journals and for outlets like Understood and the Impact ADHD site and Beyond Booksmart, they're all there, free for you to look at and download. There's some information about documentation, and you can use the contact link to ask me questions if you're listening to this webinar in the archive and you weren't with us live. On Facebook, I post articles that I find that I think are interesting in my own work when I have something new, and I'm also on Twitter, mostly reposting things that I find interesting. I also had the pleasure of seeing Teresa Maitland's videos in the Attitude Archive on college, and they're much more focused on what you can do as parents to help, prepare your students with those soft skills everybody's talking about, to get them ready for the responsibilities of college. And they are excellent, and I strongly recommend it. She also has a book on how to prepare students for college. So I would definitely check those out. And whoops, Did I go too fast? So you can enter your
No, that's
questions in
great.
the box.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth. So, listeners, if you would just post what Elizabeth covered a huge amount of territory very quickly, but we've got some more time so we can take your questions. So if you would just post in the chat box, what you'd like her to address, that would be very helpful. And then I'll just revisit, Elizabeth, with you some of my questions. I think
Sure.
you made it very clear that, and it was, eye-opening that students moving from high school to college need to be prepared for the fact that they are not automatically taking their IEP or 504 plan with them.
Right.
That colleges vary pretty dramatically in what services they provide.
Absolutely.
And the most common ones seem to be extended time and laptop use, probably more than other modifications of the courses or different standards for kids with LDs. But I just wanted to back up and talk about something that many people have posted asking about is, at what point should a student raise the issue of a disability with a college? And how can parents best determine what services a college might provide before, early on in the process?
Sure. So I think you're asking partially about the admissions process. So
to some degree, but also you don't know whether to apply or not if you don't know whether the services are good. Because the services are so different school to school, it seems like it's really important to know.
Right. Well, that's a great question.
What you're applying for,
Right. So as you do your college search, I think disability services should be part of that. Now, you're going to be able at some colleges to get a lot of information off their website. So I have seen some really great websites where they say, here are all the accommodations that we typically provide. And nobody's going to say, if you have ADHD, you get to choose what's behind door number 2, because it doesn't work that way. Everybody's viewed as an individual and gets the accommodations that she or he, are deemed appropriate based on your profile. So again, if you don't see it on the website, you can call, and if we happen to have an administrative assistance, but if you wanted to talk to what we call a coordinator, you could set up a time. And when I say you, I'd much rather it be the student making these phone calls saying, I'm thinking about applying to Hamlet University. Here's what, is happening for me at the high school level. Do you guys do that kind of stuff? And, the coordinator will say, well, we don't really give extended time for extended time for papers and projects, but yeah, we do this other stuff all the time. And by the way, students register with our office get to, one session scheduled ahead of time, at the writing center if you want. We also have special computers. We do this, we do that. So
this is a conversation you're having with the disability office before application.
Exactly. Here's what I want to assure parents, and I'm so glad that you asked this. If you call any disability services office and you say, hi, my name is Elizabeth and I need to ask you all these questions, I'd be very surprised if any of my colleagues takes out a piece of paper and a pen, writes your name down, gets your number off the caller ID,
right,
and does anything with that information.
Even remembers later who you were.
Right. We're not here to report on you. And I've had parents say that to me, that they were worried. And so, that was so out of the blue to me that anybody would ever think that. But I understand why people are very sensitive and they're very cautious, and I can't be dismissive of that. So we are here to answer questions to make sure that your student makes the decision that's best for him. So we are not, in a lot of places, except, maybe at places like, I know Curry College in Massachusetts, disability services and admissions have a relationship because they have a special fee-for-service program. But for instance, at Northeastern in Boston, you have to get into the university first before you can apply to their special LD program. So we don't have relationships with admissions. We're here to make sure you can get the information you need. It's not our job to fill slots in the freshman class. So I encourage you to talk to these people and ask them these questions so that you can get the information your family needs. We are not writing down who you are and sending it off to the admissions office. I mean, that would be unkind I just don't believe it happens.
Well, here's an issue that a couple of people have raised that seems, I know from my own experience with my daughter, seems pretty salient to me, and that is the college process for kids without LDs is overwhelming, and their parents help them. How can we possibly expect kids with learning disabilities to learn how to do this on their own?
Yes.
That's, it's a huge challenge for parents who've been advocating for their children throughout lower school and high school to suddenly come up against that moment when the school says, I can't talk to you. I can only talk to the child, right?
Right. Well, when you say the process, which part of the process?
I think this person's talking about just, negotiating registration, picking classes, everything that goes into starting in college,
right.
Is pretty overwhelming.
It certainly is. And as you pointed out, it's also overwhelming for the other freshmen who don't have disabilities. Right. I mean, I think, asking for help, we don't do advising in any of the offices I've ever worked for. Most disability services have nothing to do with advising because that's a whole other endeavor. We don't know what the requirements are, and we would not be able to do that kind of a thing. So,
although one thing I wanted to say, though, to that is my daughter went to a college where they had a course for kids who had disabilities or were otherwise at some disadvantage starting out. And it was extremely helpful in terms of advising things like don't take freshman bio, even though you did it well in high school. It's going to be overwhelming in college, or, just very specific help for kids who had LDs.
Wow.
Like another thing, it was Oberlin College, which is pretty amazing, but had amazing disability services. But I think another thing to look into when you're trying to figure out what disability services are available at a college, because they really do just really are widely divergent one from another. So let me see some of these questions. Lots of people want to know to what degree they should talk about this in the admissions process. I know, as you say, you're not an admissions
I cannot dodge that question.
I know.
So, and I understand people's concerns.
Should they write about it in their college essay? Should they talk about it? Should they disclose it? It's a hugely difficult.
So, in the first book, I interviewed a bunch of college counselors who work with students with disabilities, and they all had varying, things to say. And for the second edition, I actually got to talk to some deans of admission, including at Yale. Yeah, so I was very surprised. He was very forthcoming. But so I think it depends, is my best and yet worst answer. I think, a friend of mine who does this advising, does say that, and I think this makes sense. Like, it needs to be something that's important to your kid if she's going to write her essay about it. So there are different ways to disclose. You can write your essay about it. If you are the head of the Chad Junior chapter and you go and speak at the conference, then that's really part of who you are. But if, softball is your passion, you're probably going to write your essay about softball.
That makes sense.
And then, there's a space in the general, what they call the Common App, to say, is there anything else you want me to know? Or, you want us to know? And, all of these people have said you can certainly disclose it there. The sort of general advice that I have seen, heard from everybody is sort of try to turn it into a positive. Don't look to be making excuses, make it an explanation, not an excuse. Explanation, for instance, if your grades are very good, but your standardized testing scores are not, and perhaps, let's say, you didn't get accommodated on the exam, on the SAT or ACT, something like that, that might be an explanation instead of an excuse. Don't look for sympathy.
Right.
You never know what other kinds of stories are coming into this person's inbox, and this may not seem very sensitive, to the world if this is the biggest thing that you speak about. So I'm sorry, and I know everybody wants a really definite
that makes
answer.
enormous sense.
Yeah.
Right. So the interesting question here from Kathy, who says, now that she understands that the IEP and the 504 pretty much go out the window when you apply to college, when you start college, is that true for all disabilities, such as a hearing loss or
right.
anything? So
Absolutely.
it is, right?
And I want to say on my website under families and students, I have a whole document about after all the published and website stuff, there's a document I wrote about 504s and IEPs, and you can get a little bit more information there. But the short answer to Kathy's question is yes, but don't forget the other part of my explanation, which is that as long as the accommodations as long as you show that you have a disability, you document it sufficiently, and the accommodations you've received are the kinds that we provide in college, of course. So yes, I mean, and this is obviously out of my bailiwick, but all kinds of things are happening for students with what we call sensory disabilities, visual disabilities, hearing, motor, physical, medical, psychological. All sorts of things are happening. I just find, and again, it's mostly in the learning disabilities and ADHD community, that the kinds of accommodations sometimes these students are receiving. Okay, so let's talk about personal aids, one-on-one aids. Colleges do not provide those. We might approve one, but we have nothing to do with paying that person. We don't arrange those things. And in fact, in some places, if they're going into a dorm. So we do have students I'm aware of, again, I'm not involved in this, but I see things all the time. Students who, are wheelchair users, who are, have no use of their arms and legs, go to college, live in the dorm. Somebody comes in, helps them get dressed in the morning, use the toilet, eat, whatever it is. So those people might have to pass a security check to get into the dorm where these students are, because, that's a concern. But again, that could happen, but we are not involved with it except to the extent that we might, want to check. And there are students who do have aids. I would say they're not common at all. I've seen posts to my, my online community where it's parents who are coming with the kids, and they're not kids, obviously, they're students. I don't know how much the students actually enjoy that. That would be an interesting study to do. But, so those kinds of things can happen, but that's something like that certainly isn't common.
Okay. So here's a couple of people have asked this question. What kind of documentation is generally needed in order to qualify for disabilities? And specifically what people are asking is, and I remember this experience when my daughter was in high school, they had an evaluation done, let's say, freshman year in high school. How long do those evaluations last? Do they have to plan on redoing it senior year in order to be ready for applying for accommodations in college, or in general? I know, does this vary by school, or is there any kind of rule of thumb on how you document the disability?
Boy, I mean, I have to say ADHD is sort of the most wide-ranging of the documentation requirements that I've seen. So to start with the basics, generally, if a student got tested in high school, most colleges will find that current enough.
Anytime in high school, even if it's beginning of high school.
I will say the later the better. There is no law on this. And again, if you go to my website, I wrote a piece, I think about a year ago, about a couple of developments that had happened. It's a long, boring story, but the Department of Justice issued this, it was a guidance or a statement, I can never remember, but that applied to testing boards and not to universities specifically, ... yet. So thus far, the laws don't say you must accept documentation that is, this old or that, and that contains this. So far, they've left us alone. I'm not sure that that will continue to be, but as of whatever today is, September 14th, colleges can sort of require whatever they say they require without any interference from the government yet. So 3 to 5 years is what a lot of schools will say. So that's, within school. And when it comes to ADHD, as I said, it can really vary. Sometimes a letter from whoever diagnosed or is, treating you is enough. And I realize not all students are getting treatment. I will say that, the university where I teach currently, we require a full neuropsych. So psychoeducational testing, testing of your cognitive ability and your academic skills, as well as tests of executive function. And, we do have a referral list. We vet people in the area who charge less. You can contact me for some advice. I don't know, honestly, if it's in the handouts. I'm sorry, I did this last week. If you need to get testing, and obviously cost is a factor for a lot of this, if you Google online, university school psychology testing clinic, schools that train school psychologists often test members of the community for a much reduced price. And those reports are every bit as good as any I've ever seen from somebody who's already fully licensed. There's no reason not to do that. If you are new,
and just a follow-up question to this one. Someone's asking, once you're granted services, does that last for all 4 years, or do you need to continually document the disability?
That's a great question, too. Yes, generally, once you're in, you're in. There are students who maybe if your documentation isn't considered sufficient, the school will grant you temporary accommodations coming in and give you, a semester or a year to get what you need to be granted that permanently. But yeah, a lot of us don't have time, frankly, to circle back around and say, hey, we need more from you.
Okay, so just a response here for a couple of people one person whose son was tested 7 years ago, probably not going to be adequate for college disabilities.
Probably. And, and I got to be honest, and this, by the way, has nothing to do with any of the stuff we're talking about, but I do think it speaks to all of the self-advocacy stuff and the self-knowledge that we're talking about. Mm-hmm. If you show, your student has to come with that packet of papers to our office and say, I have a disability, here's what I need. When you hand your 12th grader something from when he was in 4th grade, how is he going to look at that and how he's progressed, since that point? How relevant will that seem to him? And again, understanding the test of cost is really the biggest factor here, and I don't want to be dismissive of that, but I do worry that we really don't have a current picture of your students functioning. And one thing I really want to point out is, remember, with all these documentation requirements, it's not that we're mean, terrible people who don't believe in ADHD, but the law says that, by the definition of a disability, it has to have a substantial limitation to your function, has to produce a substantial limitation in your functioning. And a lot of the stuff that we see for ADHD does not do anything but tell us, subjectively, well, the teachers report this and the parents say that, but we are charged with making sure that the people we give disability accommodations to actually have, are disabled. I'm not saying that people don't have, learning differences or that they don't have ADHD, but to the extent that it actually impacts your functioning and requires accommodation, ADHD, as all the experts say, is a very heterogeneous disorder, and people have different experiences with it. So we're not there to, say you don't have ADHD, but we are looking for some objective evidence that compared to your classmates, you function, lower and need to be accommodated.
Right. I will say this in my experience, that having excellent letters documenting the impact of a disability on work is really helpful. As you say, both for the disability service, but also for the student. I wanted to tell the listeners that Teresa Maitland, as you mentioned, Elizabeth, has done some wonderful webinars for us about helping college students learn in high school to advocate for themselves and how to get ready and how parents can help their kids get ready. It really was sort of an eye-opener for me as to all the things that we should have done in high school as opposed to waiting. Here's an interesting question from Crystal. She says, do students have to go through the disability office to get accommodations, or are some accommodations available by professor's discretion? So, quote, I know I'd like to use my laptop because I have a hard time with ADHD because of X, Y, or Z. Is this okay?
Right. Here's
does that happen as well? Yeah.
Okay. Does it happen? Sure, it does. Do we have numbers on that? No, we don't. I will tell you from experience, I have had students who've done it. Here's the danger. So you go see Professor A and he says, sure, I'll let you, have another 2 days to write your paper. Well, that's fine for Professor A. But don't expect Professor B to be then obligated to do that for you.
Right.
So, and let's back it up. So I'm not a student with a disability. I'm just really having a bad time. My boyfriend broke up with me. I've had a blue couple of days. I can approach the professor and say, you know what? My heart's been broken. I've been eating, ice cream and watching Game of Thrones. Can I please have 2 days? And if I catch that professor on the right day, he's going to say, sure. So anybody can do that, absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
But the danger for students is not to assume for a moment that anything that happens with that professor, and even on that assignment, he's now entitled to in any way for the rest of the semester or for the rest of his time. So that is self-advocacy, and I am a little bit wary of, discouraging it, but you have no guarantees. And if the professor says the next time, I'm really not going to do that, the fact that he accommodated you the first time doesn't obligate him to do it the second time. So, okay. And frankly, they might be, you run the risk that some professors might be put off by the idea that you come to them without,
right.
But others might be sympathetic. I don't know, and understand that you don't want to register and you feel stigmatized or whatever your reasons are, and they might be accommodating. So I would never say it was a bad idea, but you need to understand what the limits are when you get accommodated that way.
Okay. So everyone, some of you are saying, why isn't my question being asked? Because there are 500 questions, and I'm sorry we weren't able to get to all of them. But please take Elizabeth's offer up to contact her via her website. And Elizabeth, did we talk about possibly answering some questions on the Attitude website in the next few days?
Sure.
Okay,
sure.
So for those of you who want to repost your question on attitudemag.com, if you go to our community forums and you scroll down, you'll find a forum for this webinar. And if you post your questions there, Elizabeth has kindly agreed to check in over the next couple of days and try to answer some of your questions, because we know this is a complicated topic and one that causes a lot of anxiety. And I want to recommend that you go on Amazon and look for some of the guidebooks. I posted the name of one of them that cover colleges with disability services. There are some great outlines of what disability services are offered at colleges around the country. And it's really helpful to look at that and to see the variety of options. So thank you so much, Elizabeth, and thanks everybody for joining in today.
I just want to say, if you're going to post your questions, please give me a few days. You won't be surprised when I tell you that a lot of students at Columbia and every college across the country have waited until they showed up on campus to bring us their documentation.
No surprise.
This is my busiest time of year, and I'm very busy, trying to get through all of these reports so that we can accommodate our students. So, forgive me if it takes a few days to get back to you.
Thank you. We're grateful to you for giving this, generously donating your time. And I think it's a huge service. So thank you so much. And thanks everybody for listening in today.
Thanks very much.
We'll sign off. Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.